In the last lesson, we took a look at consumer-driven economics in the 1920s. In this one, we're going to take a look at American culture. The 1920s ushered in a new culture that was very different than the thinking that preceded the 1920s decade. There are 7 different characteristics here that we can see in terms of how this culture was different, but ultimately it comes down to image over substance. And there are several points in this lesson where we're going to see a sort of a tug of war between the old thinking that preceded the 1920s versus the new thinking, and we're going to see how this manifests itself in several different ways. We've already learned that women got the right to vote in 1920, and I don't know that there's a direct connection. There were rules for women's behavior, and young women in the 1920s began to violate those rules. These young women were known as flappers, and they did things such as smoke in public and drink in public and show more skin with their dress choices that they were wearing in defiance of the social convention of the time. I've talked before in other lessons in earlier units about the creation of a mass culture that developed at the turn of the century, where everybody was reading similar magazines and seeing the same advertisements. Well, with the 1920s, we can usher in a new medium called radio, and now, as you can see from the picture on the top left, people began to gather around the radio, much like people sit down to watch a specific TV show on a set date and time. People were doing the exact same thing with radio. This, of course, allowed for advertisements, and we're going to see the beginning of the broadcast networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, that are going to start as radio broadcast networks. So people across America are going to begin to listen to the same radio programs and hear the same advertisements across the nation. And again, this helps create a common mass culture. The picture on the bottom left shows President Franklin Roosevelt, who is not president until 1932, but he was masterful at using radio to speak directly to the American public. We'll talk about him more in future lessons. Millions of Americans were going to the movies to watch silent movies. Talkies are going to come out starting in 1927, and Hollywood is going to become the center of the filmmaking industry. We're going to move from those 15-minute short silent films to longer full-length feature silent films, and then, of course, films with sound once the technology develops in 1927. Radio will also, of course, start playing music, and the new music of the 1920s was jazz, which became a nationwide craze, and everybody was listening to jazz. Harlem became the capital of African American culture in the 1920s. As this list shows, we're looking at writers and artists and musicians putting out a tremendous amount of art, all of which tended to have a common theme, that being African American cultural pride. We have to take a moment to highlight Langston Hughes, a writer and poet who wrote about the joys and difficulties of being human, American, and black. The temperance movement had achieved its objective with the addition of Amendment 18 added to the Constitution in 1919. On January 1st, 1920, alcohol was no longer legal in the United States. But that doesn't mean that people didn't continue to drink, as you'll see in the next set of slides. Bars went underground and came to be known as speakeasies. They were hidden, although everyone knew exactly where they were, and speakeasies existed in every town and city across the country. The distribution of alcohol was taken over by organized criminal networks, and with only 1,500 federal agents charged with the task of enforcing the Prohibition laws, they didn't have too much difficulty distributing alcohol across the nation. Al Capone, pictured at the top, controlled the distribution of alcohol in the greater Chicago area. Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz controlled distribution of alcohol in New York. Alcohol found its way into the country in a variety of different ways. Those that carried it in came to be known as bootleggers. Actually, the term was used for anyone that distributed alcohol. Folks that lived out in the countryside often distilled their own. Federal agents did what they could, but they were largely fighting a losing battle. This was in part because local law enforcement, the local police, often ignored the speakeasies in their communities and allowed them to operate. As a result, alcohol was widely available throughout the United States, and most anybody that drank was essentially turned into a criminal, and this was large numbers of Americans that were willfully violating the law. So alcohol was going to be re-legalized by Amendment 21 in 1932, and the Noble Experiment, apologies, I've mistitled it here as the Grand Experiment, the Noble Experiment was a failure. The last thing that we're going to take a look at in this lesson goes back to something I said at the beginning of the lesson, that tug of war between older thinking and the new thinking, and in this case we're looking at the tug of war between religion and science. John Scopes was a science teacher, a biology teacher in Tennessee, and he wanted to teach evolution. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. The state of Tennessee had a law that teachers could only teach creationist theory of evolution, the Old Testament, God created the world in 7 days theory of how the world came to be. So Scopes was arrested when he attempted to start to teach evolution in his classroom, and this court case garnered nationwide attention, again because it was highlighting the clash between religion and science that was sweeping the nation, not just in Tennessee. In the bottom right-hand picture, you see the two attorneys. The prosecuting attorney was William Jennings Bryan on the right, a three-term candidate for president. On the left was John Scopes' attorney, the famous defense attorney Clarence Darrow. Ultimately, John Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. So then, to sum up the various cultural things that we looked at in the 1920s, we saw that flapper girls, the young women that were violating social convention, and in fact ended up breaking down barriers for women, making it easier for women that came after them to do more of what they wanted to do and behave the way that they wanted to behave. The Harlem Renaissance was African American cultural pride through a variety of different arts. Prohibition from 1920 to 1932 was widely ignored, and alcohol was distributed by organized criminal enterprises. And lastly, the Scopes trial highlighted the division and tension between religion and science. And these were the major cultural issues that occurred during the 1920s.